My husband's family boycotted our wedding because he was marrying down. 2 years later, my MIL came back with one unexpected request. He opened his mouth to answer. I watched his jaw work like he was chewing on the words before he let them out. 3 seconds, maybe 4. In a room that quiet, 4 seconds feels like a prison sentence. My mother forged my father's signature on a trust amendment 3 days after his stroke left him unable to hold a pen, Ethan said. I have the amendment. I have his medical chart from Overlake showing he'd lost fine motor control in his right hand by that date. And I have a notarization on the document from a notary who I don't believe was ever in the room. Richard Palmer, silver-haired, the kind of board member who'd been on the company's letterhead longer than some employees had been alive, uncrossed his arms. That was the first crack in the room. Not in Lorraine, in the room itself. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's a documented one, Ethan said, and slid the folder 2 inches further across the desk, toward Richard, not toward his mother. Lorraine's hand finally moved, not to open the folder, to close it. She pressed her palm flat on top of it like she could smother it. This is a family matter, she said, and her voice had changed. 20 seconds ago, it had been honey. Now it had an edge under the honey, like a blade wrapped in a napkin. It has no place in a board meeting. You brought the board in, Ethan said. I brought the folder. You brought the audience. A woman I hadn't noticed until then stepped forward from near the door. Dark blazer, reading glasses pushed up into short gray hair, a legal pad already in her hand like she'd been expecting to need it. I'd later learn her name was Dana Whitfield, general counsel for Bennett Holdings for 12 years, the kind of lawyer who'd outlasted 3 CEOs because she never took sides. She took facts. I'm going to need to see what's in that folder, Dana said. Not because I doubt you, Lorraine, because if there's any truth to this, the company has exposure, and my job is protecting the company. Not you personally. Lorraine's mouth opened, closed. For 2 years, I had watched this woman control every room she walked into with nothing but tone of voice and a raised eyebrow. I had been on the receiving end of that eyebrow at my own bridal shower when she'd asked me, in front of 40 guests, whether I'd considered a payment plan for my dress. I knew what her silence usually meant. It meant she was choosing her next weapon. This time, she didn't have one. Her hand was still flat on the folder, and I watched her fingers curl slightly, like she was fighting the urge to physically stop Dana from reaching for it. She lost that fight. Dana slid the folder out from under Lorraine's palm and opened it right there on the desk, standing, reading glasses down now. She flipped through the bank statements, the dissolved trust paperwork, the amendment with Walter Bennett's signature on it, a signature that, even to my untrained eye, looked wrong, too smooth, too even, like someone had practiced it in the mirror before committing it to paper. Where did you get his medical records? Dana asked without looking up. Camille has power of attorney documentation from before Dad lost capacity, Ethan said. She requested his chart, legally. She's his daughter. She is not, Lorraine started. Say it again, Ethan said, and his voice cracked down the middle, not from weakness. And I will read this whole file into the record myself. Lorraine didn't say it again. Dana closed the folder. She looked at Lorraine for a long moment, and I understood, watching that look pass between 2 women who'd worked together for over a decade, that something had just ended. Not the meeting. Something older than the meeting. I'm ordering an independent forensic review, Dana said, of the document, the notarization, and the account activity on the Bennett Family Trust going back 3 years. Effective immediately, I'm also recommending the board place a temporary hold on Lorraine's signing authority pending that review. You can't do that, Lorraine said. I can, Dana said, and I just did. I want to tell you Lorraine crumbled right there, that she cried or confessed or did something that gave us the clean, satisfying ending you'd want at minute 4 of a video. She didn't. She stood up, smoothed the front of her blazer with both hands like she was ironing herself calm, and said, "This meeting is adjourned," in a voice so steady it made my skin crawl. Then she looked at me, just me, like Ethan and the board and Dana had all left the room, and it was just her and the daughter-in-law she'd once told, at our engagement dinner, that she hoped I'd grow into the family. "You did this," she said quietly. "You put him up to this." I felt Ethan's hand find mine under the desk before I even opened my mouth. "No," I said, "you did this. 11 months before your son was born." Her face didn't move, but her eyes did, just slightly, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw something I never thought I'd see on Lorraine Bennett's face. She looked scared. I need to back up, because the boardroom wasn't where the real fight happened. The boardroom was just the first place the fight became visible to people who weren't us. I work as a paralegal at a small firm downtown. Family law, mostly, some probate. It's not a glamorous job. It's the kind of job Lorraine once described, at a Christmas party, as very practical, in a tone that made the word practical sound like an insult. I'd spent 2 years being underestimated by that family for exactly the skill set that was about to save it. Because the night after Ethan first told me about Camille, after I'd thrown those photographs at him and he'd caught them against his chest like he was catching something breakable, we sat at our kitchen table until 2 a.m., going through Evelyn's storage unit copies page by page, and I recognized the shape of what I was looking at before Ethan did. Not because I'm smarter than him, because I'd typed up a dozen trust amendments in my job and I knew what a real one looked like. This one had errors a real estate attorney wouldn't make. The witness line was blank. The date format didn't match the notary's own stamp. The stamp said the notarization occurred on a Tuesday. The calendar said that date was a Thursday. Small. Stupid. The kind of mistake that happens when someone is moving fast and thinks nobody will ever look closely enough to check a calendar. Somebody had looked. Evelyn had looked 2 years ago, and instead of going to the police with a folder full of maybes, she'd done something smarter. She'd waited, and she'd kept collecting. Why didn't she go to the police the second she found this? I'd asked Ethan that night, and he didn't have an answer. Not really. Not until later, when Camille told us herself, sitting in our living room with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank. My mom said nobody believes a mistress's daughter over a widow. She said we needed something a lawyer couldn't argue with. She was right, and now we had it. The first real crack came 9 days after the boardroom, on a Tuesday, in a strip mall office with a hand-lettered sign that said, Feld Document Examination, LLC. Marcus Feld had been a certified forensic document examiner for 22 years, half of them doing contract work for the county prosecutor's office before he went private. He had reading glasses on a chain, ink-stained fingers, and a magnifying loupe he wore around his neck like other men wore ties. Dana had hired him within 48 hours of the board meeting. Bennett Holdings, it turned out, moved fast when its own legal exposure was on the line, faster than it had ever moved for a family member. He laid the amendment out on a light table and didn't say anything for almost 4 full minutes. I remember counting them because the silence made my stomach hurt. Your father-in-law's genuine signature has what we call natural tremor, he finally said, sliding a comparison exemplar next to the amendment. An authentic signature from a stock certificate dated 8 months earlier. See the hesitation marks here, here, and here. That's a man with early-stage Parkinsonian tremor, confirmed in his medical chart, signing his own name the way he always had, imperfectly. This signature, he tapped the amendment, has none of that. It's too fluid, too confident. Whoever made this mark either traced it or practiced it extensively beforehand. Can you prove that in court? Ethan asked. I can testify to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that these 2 signatures were not produced by the same hand under the same physiological conditions, Marcus said. Whether that's enough for a jury is Dana's department, not mine. I watched Ethan's shoulders drop about 2 inches, not in relief, in grief. Because up until that light table, some small, stupid, loyal part of him had been hoping his mother hadn't actually done it, that there was an explanation, a mix-up, anything. Marcus Feld had just closed that door for good. There's something else, Marcus said, and pulled out a second exemplar, the notary stamp on the amendment, blown up on his monitor beside a clean reference stamp from the same notary's registered seal on file with the county. This impression is shallow on the left edge and doesn't fully register the security microtext along the border. That's consistent with a rubber duplicate stamp, not the notary's original embosser. Someone had faked the notary's seal too, which meant either the notary, a woman named Diane Okafor, according to the registration, was in on it, or somebody had stolen or copied her stamp without her knowledge. We drove to her office the next morning to find out which. Diane Okafor ran a tiny notary and tax prep shop wedged between a nail salon and a check cashing place. And when Ethan set copies of the amendment down on her desk, her reaction told us everything before she said a single word. Her whole face folded in on itself, and she pressed 2 fingers to her temple like she'd been hit. I did not notarize this, she said. I've never notarized anything for a Walter Bennett in my life. I'd remember that name. Bennett Holdings. Everybody knows that name. She pulled her notary journal, a legal requirement, a bound log of every notarization she'd ever performed, each one with a date, a signer's ID number, and a thumbprint, and paged back to the date on the fraudulent amendment. Nothing. No entry. No client with that name anywhere near that week. Somebody used your seal without your knowledge, Ethan said. Or somebody who worked for me did, Diane said quietly, and that was its own gut punch, because it meant this wasn't one woman acting alone in a locked office at midnight. It meant somebody had access. A temp, a former employee, someone who'd been inside this shop and walked out with an impression of a rubber stamp in their bag. Diane filed a report with the Washington Secretary of State's Notary Commission that same afternoon. It felt small at the time, procedural, a single form in a stack of forms. It would matter enormously later, because it created an official, time-stamped, third-party record, independent of us, independent of the family, confirming that the notarization on the amendment was fraudulent. Dana would call it, weeks later, the single most useful piece of paper in this entire case, because juries and prosecutors both trust a stranger with nothing to gain a lot more than they trust an estranged daughter-in-law with a grudge. I didn't have a grudge. I had a stack of receipts and a mother-in-law who'd once told a wedding photographer within my earshot to get some shots that don't emphasize her arms. But nobody needed to know that to believe Diane Okafor's notary journal. Lorraine's counterattack started exactly 9 days after that, which I only know because it landed on a Thursday, and I remember thinking darkly that at least her forgeries and her retaliation Lorraine's counterattack started exactly 9 days after that, which I only know because it landed on a Thursday, and I remember thinking darkly that at least her forgeries and her retaliation shared a work ethic. Ethan came home from Bennett Holdings at 6:40 p.m. and didn't say anything for almost a full minute after he walked through the door. He just stood in the kitchen with his laptop bag still on his shoulder, staring at the fridge like it owed him an explanation. "They suspended my badge access," he finally said. "I got to the parking garage this morning and my key fob didn't work. Security had to walk me up. HR called it a precautionary administrative leave pending internal review. She fired you. She can't fire me. I'm not just an employee, He stopped, laughed, but it wasn't a laugh that had any humor in it. I was going to say I'm family. I don't know what I am to her anymore. It got worse before it got better, the way these things always do." Lorraine froze the joint checking account she and Ethan's late father. I should say here that Walter Bennett had passed 11 months earlier after a second stroke, which was part of why this all mattered so urgently. There was no father left to ask, no version of this story where Walter cleared it up himself. Lorraine froze the account Ethan had inherited joint access to as executor in waiting. She sent a cease and desist letter through an outside attorney, not Dana, a private one, which told us Dana had drawn a hard line she wasn't willing to cross for her boss, accusing Ethan of defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. She called my own mother, whom she'd met exactly twice, and told her that I was encouraging Ethan to destroy his family for money. That one got to me more than I expected. Not because it was true, because it was so precisely, surgically designed to make me doubt myself in front of the one person whose opinion I couldn't shrug off. I sat on our bathroom floor that night with my phone in my lap and cried in the specific, ugly way you cry when someone finds the exact seam in your armor and pushes. "She's trying to isolate you," Ethan said, sitting down on the tile next to me, not touching me at first, just sitting close enough that I could feel the heat off his arm. "It's what she did to Camille's mom for 25 years. Make her small, make her feel like asking for what's hers makes her the villain. I'm not asking for anything," I said. "This isn't even my money." "No," he said, "but it's my family, which makes it yours too, whether she ever agreed to that or not." I believed him. I want that on the record, because there's a version of this story where I sit back and let the men handle it and just show up for the emotional beats. That's not what happened. The next morning, I called Priya Nandakumar. I'd worked one probate case with Priya 2 years earlier, a forensic accountant, CPA, the kind of person who could make a spreadsheet confess. She specialized in tracing money through the kind of structures people build specifically so nobody can trace it. Shell LLCs, holding companies, accounts that exist mostly to be a hallway between one place and another. I laid out everything I had. Bank statements Evelyn had kept, the dissolved trust paperwork, 3 years of Bennett family trust account activity that Dana's independent review had, somewhat grudgingly, agreed to share with us once litigation looked inevitable. Priya spent 6 days on it. She called on the 7th, a Wednesday, at 9:14 in the morning, and I remember the time because I was standing in my kitchen holding a coffee mug that went cold in my hand while she talked. "The trust originally held $2.1 million, Priya said. "Between 14 and 11 months ago, right around the time your father-in-law's health was declining fast, it was systematically drawn down through 6 transfers, each one just under $100,000, into an LLC called Meridian Family Holdings." Who owns Meridian Family Holdings? Registered agent is a law firm in Delaware. But the initial capital contribution, and every subsequent deposit, traces back to accounts controlled by Lorraine Bennett. And 8 months ago, Meridian Family Holdings purchased a property outright, cash. No mortgage. "What property?" "A 4-bedroom house on Mercer Island," Priya said. "Assessed value, $1.9 million. I sat down at my own kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had first spread out Evelyn's storage unit folder, and I thought about every dinner at Lorraine's house, every comment about practical jobs and payment plans and marrying down, every ounce of superiority she'd carried into every room she ever walked into. And I thought about the fact that she'd built almost $2 million of that superiority on top of a stolen inheritance from her own husband's other daughter. Camille was renting a 1-bedroom apartment in Tacoma and working 2 jobs to pay for her mother's chemotherapy. I know that detail lands like something out of a movie. I promise you it's just what was true. Evelyn had been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer 4 months before any of this started, which was, Camille told us later, part of why her mother finally decided to stop protecting a secret that had cost her everything and start protecting her daughter instead. "There's one more thing," Priya said before we hung up. "The 6 transfers into Meridian all happened within a 9-day window. That's unusual. Most people who are systematically diverting funds spread it out over months, sometimes years to avoid tripping compliance flags. This was fast, sloppy, like whoever did it knew they were on a clock. What clock? I don't know yet, Priya said, but I'd start asking what happened 9 days before that first transfer. We didn't have to ask long. Walter Bennett's neurologist had documented in a chart note dated exactly 10 days before the first transfer that Walter's cognitive assessment showed early signs consistent with vascular dementia, recommend evaluation of decision-making capacity and financial safeguards. Lorraine had known her window to move money using her husband's signature was closing. She'd raced the diagnosis. And she'd won that race, right up until the moment a storage unit in Tacoma outlived her certainty that nobody would ever look. By this point, we had enough for Dana Whitfield to escalate past internal review, and enough, according to the attorney Ethan and I had by then retained for ourselves, a trust litigation specialist named Robert Isili, who'd handled 3 cases almost exactly like this one in his career and lost none of them, to file both a civil claim on Camille's behalf and a criminal referral. The criminal side is where Detective Mara Choi came in. Financial Crimes Unit, 14 years on the force, the last 6 specializing in elder financial exploitation, which is technically what this was, since Walter's diminished capacity at the time of the forgery made it a crime against him as much as against Camille. Detective Choi met us in a conference room at Robert's office with a legal pad, a recorder, and none of the impatience I'd braced for. I want to be straightforward with you, she said. These cases are hard to prosecute. Family members protect each other. Memories get fuzzy on the stand. And juries don't love watching a son testify against his mother. It makes them uncomfortable even when the evidence is solid. What you've built here, though, she tapped the folder, which had grown from a manila envelope into something closer to a small filing box, is about as clean a chain as I've seen. Independent notary confirmation, independent forensic document examination, independent forensic accounting, medical records establishing a timeline of incapacity. None of that comes from you or your husband. That's what makes it hard to argue away. What happens now? I asked. I request warrants for Meridian Family Holdings' full banking records, formally interview the notary and the document examiner, and build a probable cause package for forgery, elder financial exploitation, and depending on what the bank records show, likely wire fraud since some of those transfers crossed state lines through the Delaware registered agent. She paused. And I'd encourage you not to tip your hand to her in the meantime. People who feel cornered do one of 2 things. They confess, or they run. Lorraine Bennett did not strike me as a woman built for confession. She ran, or she tried to. Priya caught it first, a flag on the Meridian Family Holdings account she'd asked Robert to get court authorization to monitor pending the civil filing. On a Thursday morning, 7:52 a.m., a wire transfer request was submitted for $1. $4 million out of Meridian's operating account. Destination a numbered account at a private bank with a correspondent relationship in the Cayman Islands. Priya called Robert. Robert called Detective Choi. Detective Choi called us, and I remember exactly where I was standing. At the stove, actually cooking eggs, the most mundane possible moment for a phone call that would blow the rest of my week apart, when Ethan picked up and I watched every muscle in his face go rigid. How long do we have? He said into the phone. Not a question, more like he was bracing for the answer. I turned the burner off. My hands were already shaking before he even hung up. The wires flagged for manual review because of the amount and the destination, he said. Standard fraud prevention hold, but it clears automatically in 24 hours unless somebody formally intervenes with the bank. Robert's filing an emergency temporary restraining order this morning to freeze the account before that window closes. If the judge doesn't sign it today, the money's gone. Cayman Islands accounts don't come back. Not without years of international litigation Camille can't afford. 24 hours. I'd read that phrase in 100 true crime headlines and never once understood, viscerally, what it does to a body. My hands wouldn't stay still. I dropped a coffee mug in the sink and didn't even register the crack of it breaking until Ethan flinched at the sound. We spent that day in Robert's office instead of at work, both of us, watching him draft an emergency motion while Detective Choi coordinated with the bank's fraud department, and Priya sat at a second laptop building a supporting financial exhibit in real time. Exhibit D, it would eventually be called in the filing. 40 pages of transaction histories with the 6 original trust withdrawals highlighted in yellow and traced, arrow by arrow, straight to the pending Cayman wire. At 4:50 p.m., 40 minutes before the county courthouse's filing window closed for the day, Robert got the TRO signed. King County Superior Court, Judge Patricia Renwick presiding. The order froze all assets held by Meridian Family Holdings, pending a full hearing the following week. I have never in my life felt relief the way I felt it at 4:52 p.m. that Thursday. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like finally. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like finally being allowed to put down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy heavy it was. Lorraine's wire never cleared. Detective Choi told us later that the bank's fraud department flagged it independently before the TRO even landed, because the destination account had triggered a suspicious activity report of its own, which meant Lorraine hadn't just been caught by us. She'd been caught by the same system she'd spent 30 years learning how to navigate around. The arrest happened 11 days later on a Monday, and I only know the details because Detective Choi called Ethan out of courtesy before it hit the news. King County prosecutors charged Lorraine Bennett with 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and 3 counts of first-degree theft, with the wire fraud charges still under federal review given the Cayman Islands transfer attempt. She was booked and released on bond within hours, the kind of quiet, unremarkable processing that happens to people with good lawyers and no flight risk on paper, even though she'd just tried, quite literally, to fly her money out of the country. The board of Bennett Holdings didn't wait for a conviction. 2 weeks after the charges were filed, they voted 7-1 to remove her as chair and CEO, citing conduct incompatible with fiduciary duty to the company. Richard Palmer, the same board member who'd uncrossed his arms in that first meeting, was the one who moved the vote. Dana Whitfield reinstated Ethan's badge access the same afternoon, along with a formal written apology for the administrative leave, which Ethan told me he read once, folded up, and never mentioned again. The story made the local business press before it made anything bigger. A reporter named Tasha Reyes at the Puget Sound Business Journal had been quietly working a source inside the county prosecutor's office for a separate elder fraud series and picked the case up almost by accident. Her article ran under the headline, "Bennett Holdings Chair, Charged with Forging Late Husband's Signature to Divert Family Fortune." And it was accurate, and it was thorough, and it included one detail that made me put the paper down and just breathe for a minute. A quote from Camille, the first time she'd spoken publicly about any of it. "I didn't want revenge," she told Tasha Reyes. "I wanted my father's daughter to matter as much as his other one did. That's all I ever wanted." The civil case settled 4 months later rather than going to trial. Robert said Lorraine's criminal defense attorney pushed hard for it. Once the federal wire fraud review came back with enough evidence to make a plea deal look a lot more attractive than a jury. Camille received $2.3 million, the original trust amount plus interest and legal costs, funded through the forced sale of the Mercer Island house Meridian Family Holdings had bought with her father's stolen money. I like to think there was some kind of justice in that specific detail, that the house had to be sold, that strangers now live in the rooms Lorraine bought with somebody else's inheritance, that she never got to unpack a single box in it before it was gone. Lorraine pleaded guilty to reduce charges 8 months after the boardroom meeting, where all of this became visible to anyone but us. Forgery in the 2nd degree, theft in the 1st degree. The elder exploitation and federal wire fraud charges were dropped as part of the deal, which frustrated Ethan more than almost anything else in the whole ordeal. He wanted the word exploitation attached to what she'd done to his father, on paper, permanently. Robert told him that's not usually how plea deals work, that prosecutors trade the harder-to-prove charge for the guaranteed conviction, and that a guilty plea to theft and forgery still meant she'd carry a felony record for the rest of her life. It still didn't feel like enough to him. I understood that. Some debts don't get repaid in a courtroom. They just get acknowledged there. She was sentenced to 14 months. With credit given for good behavior likely to bring that closer to 10, and ordered to pay restitution on top of the civil settlement. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, said something I wrote down on my phone because I never wanted to forget the exact wording. The defendant did not simply steal money. She stole the ability of a dying man's 2 children to know each other as siblings while there was still time. That harm has no dollar figure attached to it, and this court cannot restore it. It can only acknowledge it. I saw Lorraine exactly once after the sentencing, in a courthouse hallway, waiting for an elevator that was taking too long. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. She was the same height she'd always been, the same straight spine, the same expensive haircut, even now. Smaller in the way a person gets when the thing holding them up from the inside has been removed. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me across her desk that first day, like I was something she still couldn't quite believe had ended up standing in her way. "I hope you're happy," she said. I thought about every version of the answer I could give her. The angry one, the petty one, the one that would have felt good for exactly as long as it took to say it, and then hollow for a long time after. "I am," I said instead. "Not because of this. In spite of it." The elevator came. She got on it. I didn't. It's been a little over a year now since the boardroom. Ethan is back at Bennett Holdings, though he's talked more than once about leaving. Not out of anger, just out of a quiet, growing sense that he wants to build something that isn't tangled up with his mother's name on the letterhead. Camille comes to dinner most Sundays. She and Ethan don't have the relationship of 2 people who grew up together, and they've both said more than once that they're not trying to fake that they do. What they have instead is quieter and, I think, more honest. 2 adults who found out late that they'd been cheated out of a childhood as siblings, and who've decided the least they can do now is not waste any more of it. Evelyn finished chemo 6 weeks ago. clean scans. She came to Thanksgiving this year and cried in my kitchen, not from grief this time, and told me she'd spent 25 years believing nobody would ever choose to believe her over a Bennett. I told her I understood exactly what that felt like, from a much smaller seat at the same table, and we didn't need to say anything else about it after that. I still work as a paralegal, still practical. Lorraine used to say that word like it was the smallest thing a person could be. I've come to think practical was the only reason any of this ever got fixed. Not the money, not the name on the building, not the marble floors, a storage unit full of receipts, a calendar that didn't match a stamp, a woman who noticed because noticing small, unglamorous details had been her job for years before it ever became her family's salvation. Lorraine skipped our wedding because she said I was marrying down. 2 years later, she came into my kitchen to hand me proof of a lie, hoping it would burn her son's marriage to the ground. Instead, it burned down the one she'd spent 30 years building on somebody else's stolen inheritance. She was right about one thing in the end. She just never figured out which family it would cost her.